The stories shared in this podcast reflect personal experiences and perspectives. While names and identifying details may be changed, these accounts are told truthfully to the best of our knowledge. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as fact about any specific individual or organisation without independent verification. Our intention is to share experiences, not to cause harm or defame. This podcast deals with themes of emotional abuse, manipulation, and deception. We share these stories not to sensationalize, but to understand how it happens, why it's so hard to see from the inside, and what it takes to break free. Please take care while listening.
I can't forget what you said. It was reckless to use those words. Now I'm stuck on you, and I keep having these dreams where you run away from me, and I know it's not real, but I'm lost on how to feel.
By this stage, Jess wasn't just overwhelmed by what had happened. She was overwhelmed by the range of things that had happened, all orbiting this one man who lived life at full volume. Because the version of Danny that everyone else saw was magnetic. Big gestures, big feelings, big declarations of love. He was larger than life, full of passion and devotion. And Jess wasn't immune to that. Most people wouldn't be. But the Danny she got in private was different. The spiraling, chaotic, contradictory version. The one who needed saving at all hours from dangers that always seemed to shift, multiply, or defy logic entirely. It created a kind of emotional double vision, two realities operating at once and Jess constantly trying to reconcile them. And she tried to believe that the worst was behind her. She tried to believe the story had finally reached its limit. But Danny didn't have limits. He only had escalation. Okay, so let's talk about humanity.
I want to preface this episode by noting when I look back, I can see the pattern so clearly that it almost feels textbook. Back then, though, I had no perception of what was going on. I only had chaos. It felt like love, but that scares the shit out of me because what love should ever feel like that? Over the first 7 months, the dynamic between us settled into this cycle that he could activate at any time. He often reflected on things that I had supposedly said that were hurtful or devaluing, and he insisted that my response was the source of his distress.
Like Tom Hardy.
Yeah, like that guy. He told me I had triggered dissociative episodes and that I had caused deep hurt by not repairing suitably. At the time, I believed him. In those moments of chaos, which I now understand as a pattern of emotional overwhelm, I would fold. I would apologize for whatever he accused me of just to bring back calm. When I eventually grew strong enough to push back, even gently, I would realize immediately that my attempt to clarify things had just made the situation worse.
So we've had conversations with people since the start of this podcast that have really helped to cement that truth for you, that there wasn't really a way around it, that he was always going to put you in this position and ask you to be accountable for these things. And it was almost what he's been trained to do. Does that make you feel better or worse about the situation now?
I think it makes me feel both. I think it makes me feel sad for the person I was back then because she had no hope of ever doing the right thing. And that's all I wanted to do was find the right answers so that we could get past whatever was holding us back. But it also validates a lot of what I struggled with. And so it is bittersweet. Instead of us working through misunderstandings, my efforts to soothe him seemed to become evidence against me. He even had a name for this. He called it my reversal phase. He said I would say sorry and beg for understanding during his outbursts, and later return to hurt him again by denying him my aforementioned apology.
What's so frustrating about that is it's a little bit of hot, kettle, black, right? Because that's exactly what he would do to you. He would create these intense periods of hurt and blame and then soothe it over with apology just so he could come back in again and create a bit of chaos. It's very frustrating.
My interpretation is that this was part of a larger pattern that kept me unsteady and unsure of myself. I always wanted to bring it back to the calm, so he always had the upper hand in this situation. He felt power in the chaos, and I felt exhausted in the chaos. The rhythm became familiar, the steps became predictable, and it almost writes like this 12-step guide to gaining and maintaining control in the relationship.
I mean, step 1.
Choose someone who avoids confrontation, who doesn't like being the cause of hurt, and has a sensitive nervous system.
Step 2.
Create safety. In those moments, gather as much personal information about the person as you can. Bank it. You'll need this for later.
Step 3.
Share your own deep wounds and praise them for their care and compassion.
Step 4.
Express hurt over things they didn't mean to do, or in some instances have not done at all, and wait for their explanation or their denial.
Step 5.
Initiate small conflicts and teach them that leaving during conflict is the worst thing that they can do to you. Ask them to never leave the room or abandon while in conflict.
Step 6.
Resolve. Love intensely. Call them your home, your soulmate, your forever.
And step 7.
Again, tell them that they've done something wrong. You can use an old issue if you like, it doesn't really matter at this point. Just make them feel like they've done the wrong thing and they are at fault.
Step 8.
Escalate, scold, belittle, cry, shame, and make it feel like they are responsible.
Step 9.
Compare them to others who seem to support you better and who actually agree with you about their behaviour. If you can engage a therapist to support with this narrative, even better. That feels like gold standard coercive dynamics.
Step 10.
Insist that they are refusing to repair the damage. Tell them they are unwell and incapable of repair.
Step 11.
Twist their words and make explanations feel impossible. Never let them successfully explain themselves. They must never feel like they can resolve the issue.
And step 12, with a bullet.
Yell, abuse, self-harm, accuse, scold, sleep deprive. On occasion, threaten to take your own life in an extreme and violent way, and make sure they know it'll be their fault. That really makes their anxiety peak. Return to step 6 of the cycle. Repeat step 6 through to 12 over and over, speeding up the process each time until the person on the receiving end feels completely destabilized and reliant on you to ease the anxiety you caused.
And that is how the cycle achieves full control. Patterns like this are so aligned with dynamics seen in coercive control and trauma bonding. And when I think back to this time as an observer of it all, it really seems like this was very much alive in your relationship dynamic. And he really leaned into the intermittent reinforcement that these cycles rely on, right? That idea that the brain becomes conditioned to move between distress and relief, which ultimately creates emotional attachment, loyalty, and confusion. And over time, the constant shifting between affection and punishment can weaken a person's self-trust, autonomy, and sense of reality. And to be perfectly honest, that's exactly what it looked like.
Yeah, and this is particularly powerful when the person on the receiving end already has a nervous system shaped by past trauma. My already developed survival instincts made this relationship feel both frightening and impossible to leave. And what strikes me now is just how overwhelming the cycle was. It happened constantly. And one of the themes he returned to repeatedly was the idea that I had spoken about my past relationships in graphic detail and that this had hurt him deeply. For a long time, I believed I had actually caused this pain. I tried to stop talking about anything from my past, but the arguments didn't stop. He would raise the issue again and again. He'd interrogate me. He'd question me. He'd ask me to explain myself, all starting from the beginning. And every time I tried to clarify or defend myself, he seemed to draw more information from me. And then that gave him more material. He would say I would never resolve the hurt because I would not acknowledge what I had supposedly done, and that became more fuel for the cycle. It happened so often that it is impossible to pull apart every example in this podcast. The volume is simply too much. At the very end of our relationship, I exported one chat platform's history into a spreadsheet just to count the messages, and there were around 66,000 of them.
66,000 messages.
And that's just from one chat platform. We communicated across multiple, and that's not including in person. The majority were long circular rants about this same supposed harm. And looking back now, I'm almost certain that the details he fixated on only existed because he'd asked me about them in the first place. And it's just wild to reflect on. While going through the messages helps me see the pattern clearly, it also is just devastating. I can see how often I collapsed under pressure, how often I had tried to soothe him, how hard I worked to avoid upsetting him. Reading it now feels like I was just this completely different person. I can almost graph this decline of my sense of self and my strength and my confidence. You can see the slope from beginning to the end of the relationship, down to the point where I was barely there anymore.
But I think it's really critical to acknowledge that there was a deep power imbalance in this relationship. I mean, he worked as a psychologist and spoke often about his professional insight and vast experience in the field, right? So it's scary, both in the sense that if you had raised concerns, he would have been responding with the authority of someone who is an expert on the issue, but also, as an expert on the issue, he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how to trigger you when he wanted to and soothe when it suited him.
It felt like he understood exactly how to reach into my vulnerabilities, how to talk about trauma, and how to frame emotional conversations in ways that left me uncertain of myself. I cannot say what his intentions were, but this is how the dynamic felt from my side. It often seemed as though he knew which emotional levers would weaken me and make me more compliant. I recall him saying to me that he needs to remember that there was a significant educational difference between us. He would often lay a string of complaints on me and then ask me to paraphrase and explain what he'd just said to me. And when I would attempt to show him I understood, it just would never be correct. That was my experience of our entire relationship. I never truly understood what was going on, and not because I only held an undergrad degree, but because none of it made sense. And I can see that so clearly now.
What a dick.
Yeah.
What's really hard to reconcile now is the idea that someone could shape a dynamic like this with purpose, especially that someone could shape a dynamic like this with someone they profess to love. Did you ever feel when you were in it like anything he was doing was calculated or intentional?
Not at the time, never. It was too overwhelming to get my head around all of the layers. I was too deep in it to see the manipulation of it all. Even now, I can't say what his intentions were, but from where I stand, the pattern feels highly deliberate. It feels as though he knew exactly how to influence me, exactly how to activate that sense of responsibility I carry, and exactly how to use it as a lever. And once that lever existed, he could pull it whenever he needed to. I can see moments in the messages where this played out. Times when his version of events did not line up and I started to question things, and then suddenly the focus was redirected onto something I had supposedly done. Other times it felt like something must have happened in his own world. Maybe someone else had upset him or he felt out of control and the distress landed on me instead. From my side of the relationship, it often looked like I became the place where he released whatever pressure he was carrying.
But what I can't wrap my head around is that he was accusing you of some pretty wild things and treating you as his emotional dumping ground. But he also seemed to be seeking out ways to experience or create drama in his day to day. Like for every situation, he always seemed to take the path of most resistance. So there was a never ending list of dramas that needed resolving. At the time, did you ever wonder if the actual problem here was how Danny approached life?
While going back through our text exchanges, I've noticed things that genuinely surprised me. For so long, I had believed I had done many of the things he said I'd done. I thought I had disclosed too much about my past, that I had somehow shamed him or belittled him without meaning to, and this was the harm that he kept referring to. I had even justified it in my own mind. But reading the messages now, what stands out is how consistently I told him how much I adored him. There is message after message telling him how wonderful he was, how impressed by him I was, how perfect he felt to me. It is constant throughout the entire relationship. I really did try to build him up, and it was never false. I was genuinely in awe of this person who I believed was my forever love. I thought we were building a life together. I admired him and I wanted to be a part of his world, but it was never the salve that he needed. He even angered once when I used the phrase one of the best, as if it was offensive to think that someone else had made the cut in the past.
I mean, God forbid you had known other men prior to knowing Danny existed on the planet, Jess. But I want to remind you, though, you did actually fight back sometimes. And I really think it's important to emphasize you often verbalize that you were not okay or not okay with a relationship. He just knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah, while I had always thought I was the weak one in the relationship, it wasn't a simple crumble on my behalf. I can almost see how he tried different approaches to see what would derail me most effectively. And there were moments where I found strength and refused to let him convince me of things I knew to be incorrect. There were moments where I pushed back, where I tried to leave, where I made it clear that I would not simply lie down. I think that was part of the challenge for him early on. He couldn't control me through my own insecurities, so the dynamic shifted into something else. His attempts to tell me I was jealous, or that I was controlling, or that I was insecure fell flat. So instead, he made himself vulnerable, and I began to feel responsible for him, responsible for his emotional safety and his stability. He knew I never wanted to be the cause of someone else's pain, so he often told me I had harmed him or triggered him, and that activated every ingrained instinct I had to repair, to soothe, to protect, and to avoid causing that pain.
When you say vulnerable, what do you mean?
He would say that he was going to end his life and that I had broken him and that I was messing with his sense of reality. He would threaten to leave the country. It wasn't just me and him in this relationship. He had children. He had a life here, and I didn't want to be the cause of his life imploding.
Okay, so it's like he really shifted into this vulnerability so you couldn't leave without feeling like you had abandoned him and caused him to abandon everybody else in his life too.
Exactly. And even during the moments where I found my strength, the moments where I bit back and tried to pull myself away from this chaos and this cycle, and I tried to reclaim some of that sense of myself, it felt like he found something new to pull me back in. Another hook, another reason that tapped straight into this sense of responsibility and care. And to be honest, it wasn't hard to pull me back in. I loved him. I wanted us to work. So any sign of vulnerability from him, any explanation about why he was hurting was enough for me to go, oh, maybe this is not about me at all. Maybe he's struggling with something bigger. There was always a reason: cancer, mental health, the stress of his separation and his ex wife, work overwhelm, him being the one who always had to save someone else. There was always something that made me feel like I needed to stay close and help.
So do you think with Danny, his control method was not necessarily in undermining you, but through using what he knew of your attachment style and creating situations where you felt you had to fix him?
Exactly. He would end up in situations where I felt compelled to step in, calm everything down, and put things back together. And that was the hook. I moved into this fixer role, desperate to restore peace. That drive to repair what he'd broken became the thing that kept me in this cycle. I would deep clean his house when it looked like a dumpster. I would make sure he had food. I would encourage him to sleep. I would help with his work where he'd let me. I would try and find solutions for people he'd been trying to rescue.
It almost sounds like you were his full time carer at this point. But I'm curious, you shared in the last episode a deeply personal insight into your own mental health struggles around this time and mentioned that it almost felt like he knew he'd pushed a bit too far. But that didn't seem to stop him coming in with these bizarro dramas for you to respond to.
Yeah, I think that is key, right? He couldn't attack me directly, and he knew the way was to get this chaos and give me a sense of control somehow. Actually, I just had an epiphany.
Go on.
Because that's what he did, right? He couldn't keep attacking me directly because he knew it was pushing me too far. So then how could he control me? He could go, oh, she feels control when she can fix something. And so he created all these things that I thought I had a false sense of control. Cleaning his house gave me a false sense. Oh, good Lord, this guy is good at what he does. The week after the hotel incident, when I was at my lowest and had contemplated taking my own life, he had started the week at a place of real vulnerability. He was the one talking to a therapist and he wasn't doing so well. And I was really worried about him. And then suddenly he told me he had to drop everything and drive a few hours to go support a friend whose partner had just taken their own life.
Jesus, that's really heavy.
Yeah, and he said he hadn't seen this person for a few years, but he was the one who had to go and comfort him. He described it as tragic and heartbreaking and something that should never have happened.
I remember a conversation we had about this incident quite clearly, actually, because you seemed to be choosing your words incredibly carefully when you explained it to me. And for every sentence, it felt like you were being so careful to pull it back in some way to a deficit in your own psychology, like hyper self awareness. And I can remember feeling your frustration with his choice to drop everything and drive for hours to rescue someone only he could save. But it also seemed that you were feeling like you were being unreasonable in that frustration.
It just seemed like real wicked timing. It was exactly what we had just been through the weekend before. And maybe my concerns were because he was so caring for this third party situation where he had literally been driving me to the same place. How could he go there knowing he'd push me to that very point and look another person in the face and support them with such care?
Given the timing and what had happened to you, do you ever wonder if he might have fabricated the story to make sure you didn't take your own life, no matter how far he pushed you?
At the time, I absolutely took it as a message that I should never let myself get to that point again.
Who was this guy? Had you heard of him before? Were they old friends? Did he just come out of nowhere?
I had never heard of this person before. He said that they used to work together or something a long time ago, and that since his separation with his ex wife, this guy had been reaching out to him, but he just didn't answer his calls and he felt really guilty. But I have very little detail about who this person was.
Did he actually explicitly tell you that Jason's partner had taken his own life?
He told me Jason had called him or maybe sent him a message and told him that he was suicidal himself. And then all of a sudden, Danny couldn't get a hold of him. And so Danny was panicking and trying to get a hold of his friend, and they weren't answering the phone. So he was worried that because they'd lost their partner, they were really vulnerable themselves. I have had a look back at our message exchange at this time because the feelings I had were entirely complex. I was so worried about Danny myself. He was in a position where he was falling apart. I wasn't well, and I just wanted him to be still. I didn't want him to go anywhere and be supporting someone in such a vulnerable position. And so I was trying my hardest to gently ask him to just not do this one, to just support this person from a distance. You don't have to embed yourself in this problem. It was such a hard thing to try and negotiate. How do you tell someone to not help someone else who's just lost their partner?
What about this situation makes you think he had created it to be aligned to where you were at emotionally the weekend just passed?
Well, it was a situation that had literally just happened to us. It was like a copy paste. I go through the messages and I can even see this symbolic reference to what had happened to us. And he is telling me how sad the whole situation was. And then he says to me, "Never suicide shit again. Never. I love you." Looking back, I don't know what was real or symbolic in relation to many things that he claimed had happened in our relationship. What I do know is that day, it didn't land the way I think he hoped it would. Instead of pulling me closer, it made me deeply frustrated. It felt like he was throwing himself into other people's crises while his own world was crumbling, and I was the one trying to gather his pieces. I was desperately trying to bring us back to calm, while he seemed to be everywhere but his own life.
Well, I mean, Danny's humanity, there's always a reason that can be invented to save someone who doesn't actually want and probably doesn't need to be saved when your name is Danny. Have you ever found out the truth of this situation?
No, I never did, and I never actually met Jason throughout the period of our relationship. I definitely know he was going somewhere that night because he'd called me from the car, but I just had no way of confirming that what he had said had happened did.
So if he wasn't going there for the reason he told you he was, what does your instinct tell you he was going there to do?
Knowing everything that I know now, I think he was going to have sex with Jason.
And there is a whole other can of worms we have not yet opened.
Danny, the undying savior.
So many services offered.
This became another huge theme of contention between us.
The services offered or the humanity?
Him, the real undying humanitarian, and me, the controlling girlfriend trying to keep him away from his life's purpose and all the broken people that surrounded him. But I just wanted him to start prioritizing fixing his own chaos and putting an end to it so we could finally start this life together. He would always find someone he had to save, people who would appear out of nowhere, suddenly playing huge roles in his life, but they always came with their own baggage. Single mothers with drug problems, single mothers in broken homes, homeless people with nowhere else to turn.
And all of them with their own uniquely fascinating story of how dear they were to him, right? Something I always found really confusing through this narrative of him being the humanitarian and savior, though, is that he'd often use these characters as both a way to highlight the good in him, but he would inevitably flip and they would become a convenient scapegoat for whatever he needed to blame on them.
Yeah, he had many of these people appear in his life, and it was often people I'd never heard of before. In our time together, he'd never mentioned them or brought them up. It was always quite a shock to me that someone would be turning up at his door with this huge problem and expect that he would be the one to help them. Around this point in our relationship, and I think it was around a time where he was trying to drag me back in after I'd had enough, he introduced this story about a woman from his past, someone I'll call Laura, who he said had once become fixated on him and then turned vengeful when he tried to pull away. He never explained her exact role in his life, only that she'd been close enough to cause damage when things soured. The things he told me she'd done were horrific, the sort of claim so extreme that I felt I had no choice to believe him. Like, who in their right mind would fabricate something like that? And there was never any way for me to validate any of it because everything was wrapped in secrecy. There was always an ongoing investigation that he said couldn't be discussed, always a warning that probing too far would compromise the integrity of his case. So I learned to sit back, believe what I was told, and try to understand the pressure he said this invisible threat was putting on his life. Over time, Laura became a constant presence in our relationship. This distant villain he insisted was responsible for every new crisis, operating just out of my sight.
It's interesting because over time, the cycle of his abuse became really knotted into this growing storm of crisis, people, pressures, and dramas that seemed to appear from just about every angle. And it was so heavily layered, I don't know how you could keep up with it, and I don't know how he could keep up with it, to be honest. It just feels ultimately so deceptive because I know you were questioning the cancer, the DID, the people around him, the drug usage. But it always seemed like the systems and the infrastructure that existed around him would pop in right at the exact moment that you needed to be validated that he was the good man you'd seen in him. I mean, let's not forget that on the surface, he's a well respected psychologist treating vulnerable people every day, despite the heaviness of his personal life at the time. And surely he wouldn't be allowed to practice if he wasn't a good man doing a good job, right? And he appeared to be a wonderful and devoted father, despite the challenges of his divorce and everything else. And surely he wouldn't be allowed to be around his children if he wasn't a safe man, right? And all of these people seem to adore him. So surely, if he was a bad guy, he wouldn't have a devoted community, right? It just seems like there were no outward tells from anybody else, and that must have been really confusing.
It was entirely confusing. All I had to rely on was my own perception. And by this point, he had broken me down so much that that was one thing that I was doubting was my own perception of what was happening. I must have been the problem because by all accounts elsewhere, he was great. Our arguments would drag on for hours, looping back on themselves until was spiraling and talking about ending his life. And I was left terrified for his safety. And not only terrified for his safety, but I was the one causing it. He would end the relationship and then continue arguing long into the night. He'd dissect my words for the tiniest inconsistencies, turning nothing statements into these moral betrayals.
And so it almost feels a bit like all of these characters around him who really justified that he was a good man actually ended up playing into your ability to be so easily abused and controlled by this guy.
Yeah, because if I was the one who was the problem,
If
how
nobody else seemed to have a problem.
it was me. Yeah. I remember one argument where he'd fixated for hours on this throwaway comment. I can't even remember how it happened, but he then twisted into a demand that I recount every partner I had ever had, rank them by penis size, and justify exactly where he sat on that list. Now, I don't know about you, but I have actually never banked in my memory the size of my partners from smallest to biggest, but he
Oh, do you not have that spreadsheet we all get given? I'll email it to you. It's fine.
great. Um, that actually does lead into a really funny I think is the word story about a list I had, but we'll save that for when it comes up. But at this time, it spiraled into a grand narrative about racism, degradation, and these open wounds that I was apparently responsible for triggering. All while he pushed me to unpack my entire past so he could feel like he'd outperformed every man who came before him. And then there was all the things falling apart in his life. And then there were all the other people he was saving. It was bewildering and exhausting. Yet at the very same time, we were also progressing. Like some of the aspects in a relationship were just such normal relationship things.
Well, yeah, there were very normal aspects of your relationship. And I think it's important to highlight that because had you been introduced to his children at this time?
Yeah, I finally met his children in person and they were beautiful moments. I absolutely adored them. They were incredible kids, and being with them felt like a completely different reality to this chaos he created everywhere else. Despite everything happening around us, my relationship with his children grew into probably one of the brightest parts of our relationship. I built a bond with them slowly and gently, earning their trust through play and stories. We had lots of silly moments in the car. He would record them and they'd send me videos, and we'd have quiet conversations at home. They absolutely brought so much joy into my days, and they really cut through the chaos with their innocence and their curiosity. And he was always a devoted father in front of them. He was patient and affectionate, which made those moments feel even more genuine and safe for me. Being with the children gave me a sense of calm and purpose, a reminder that there was goodness in this family despite the turmoil festering when they weren't there. I cared for them deeply, and the love I felt when we were together was one of the few uncomplicated things I had during that time.
And had you met his ex wife at this point?
No, because apparently she kept putting off meeting me, and he'd framed it as though she was using it as leverage to get him to settle and give her most of their assets or something. My perception of her around this time grew into this ex wife who was hell bent on destroying him. It felt like she was adding to the chaos in his life when it didn't have to be so hard.
And what about other normal areas of your relationship? And I think I mean specifically sex and intimacy. Was that a challenge for you at this point?
No, well, not from my point of view. I think we were always really safe in the intimacy area. However, because the arguments were escalating and becoming more and more frequent, we would find ourselves fighting rather than being intimate. He'd also started bringing up some really interesting fantasies, I suppose we'd call them, for him. And sometimes it felt like he was trying to pull me from my boundaries and get me to lean into desires that he had.
What kind of fantasies?
So I think earlier we mentioned how he talked about wanting to do an OnlyFans, and I had kind of brushed it aside. But he started leaning into the idea of escorting. And he'd say things to me like, "You'd be so good at it." And he'd show me examples of websites where people were advertising themselves. By this point, I knew not to oppose his opinions immediately, and I sort of let him talk to me about it. He did say to me one time he had been seeing this guy and he offered to give him $20 for sleeping with him, and he said how it felt so good and it was just the idea of being rewarded for it. It was all very strange for me, and it was kind of weaved in between everything else that was going on. It didn't end with the escort fantasy. He would jump into quite confronting things. He once told me about a rape fantasy that he had, and it was quite shocking to me. And he'd explained it to me in great detail. And it felt like he'd put me in these positions where he'd say such extreme things that I didn't know where to move with it, but be gentle with him and accept him for what he was saying, because there was a huge theme around me not accepting him and him not belonging with me. So I had to be really careful with how I responded to these things, whilst also trying to maintain my own boundaries and my own desires in the relationship.
You mentioned before about your belief he may have been sleeping with other people at this stage, particularly a man. I remember around this time, another character entered his life in a very bizarre way. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, another layer of complication entered our relationship when he told me about a transgendered woman from overseas whom I will call Lani. The story he gave me was that he had been running this workshop at a conference centre near his home when Lani walked in, distressed, crying, and asking for help. According to him, her boyfriend had abandoned her midway to the airport. She had no money to continue her journey, and she was terrified about returning to a country where transgendered people were persecuted. He said his humanity took over, and he left the workshop to drive her to the airport. He gave her a significant amount of money so she could transfer her ticket, leave the country, and come back and later seek asylum. He framed it as an act of compassion that he just couldn't ignore, even though he was struggling financially himself, and he felt conflicted about the sacrifice. Their contact continued after this, and she seemed to believe he wanted something more with her, which he brushed off as a misunderstanding. But for me, it became another point of tension. It hurt on a personal level, knowing that she was flirting and imagining a future with him, but it also frustrated me that he kept prioritizing dramatic new crises and connections rather than facing the problems already consuming his life and our relationship.
Considering that you were so deeply embedded in his ability to basically function at this stage, were you worried about going to Europe?
I was. I had thought about the idea of leaving the country and leaving him in this chaos and not having any control over the outcomes of things that would pop up. We started talking more seriously about me helping him with his business so he could catch up on work that had snowballed beyond his control. And with this long service leave approaching and my trip to Europe only a few weeks away, I felt this growing urgency to get him into a stable position before I left. Practical support made the most sense to me, so I committed to doing what I could.
Wait, didn't you even end up renovating his bathroom?
Yeah, one of the biggest tasks that I took on was his bathroom. The insurance company was still pushing back on his claim, and I had had experience renovating my own home, and I knew a lot about bathroom renovations, so I figured I could do it at a fraction of the cost, and then he'd at least be able to stop hotel living while I was gone. And it wasn't just a simple leak. This was a complete rebuild. I stripped the whole thing back and renovated it from the ground up. And I only had a single week off between finishing work and flying overseas, but I convinced myself I could get it done. I worked around the clock and somehow managed to transform most of the bathroom in those few days.
How did he behave while you were taking on these massive tasks?
Well, even while I was doing all of this, the abusive cycle was still very active. He would still find reasons to say I had upset him or triggered him, and the emotional pressure never really relented. I remember one day when my mum was coming to help me with the renovation. I was racing the clock, but he had made plans for me to join him and his kids and some friends of his for waffles. I'd never met these people, and the timing was just impossible. So when I said I couldn't go, he abused me for ruining the plan and made a big thing about the kids needing predictability and that I can't leave them hanging on plans. I recall picking up my bag to leave during that argument, and he told me to get out, but something in me couldn't go. I couldn't abandon him with this job half done, and I couldn't go off to Europe knowing we were separated. Moments like that kept me on edge. I felt constantly monitored and constantly afraid of misstepping, even when I was doing everything I could to help him rebuild his life.
So you were presumably spending a lot of time, a lot more time than you normally would in his home at this point. Were these characters that kept popping up present?
No, no one was physically present in his house when I was around. I never actually got to meet a lot of these people. There were more arguments about Lani during this time, though. She became another fault line in this already very unstable landscape. Even during what was meant to be the special night at a hotel before my trip, he spent long stretches on the phone to her. She was telling him how much she loved him and how he was her savior, and he was really lapping it up. I felt really disappointed and confused watching him on that phone call. When he even caught a hint of that on my face, he turned it on me and said I had hurt him with my disappointment. He punished me for having any emotional response at all. It was surreal to sit in a room designed for us to connect before I went off for a month, while he prioritized someone else in another country and then blamed me for reacting like a human being. Staying with him while I renovated the bathroom meant we spent more consecutive time together than we ever had. On one level, it felt really good to be close and to share meals and small moments of quiet between the chaos, but underneath that, I was completely exhausted. I was trying to hold up his life with my own two hands while absorbing this volatility at every turn. By the time I boarded my flight for Europe, I was drained in every possible way. I felt worn down, fragile, and depleted. I left as a shell of myself, carrying far more weight than anyone in love should ever have to carry.
I remember really thinking to myself at the time, she's not going to go. Something will happen and he will cancel this, or she'll have a reason that she has to stay. And I remember being quite surprised that you actually left.
Yeah, I don't blame you for being surprised. I had had discussions with a few people in my life about it, and people were telling me, "Don't let him ruin your trip. You've been planning this for a few years." And I think what pushed me and kept me going is that I was going with people who I have loved and known my whole life, and I couldn't let them down. And so I went because I didn't want to be the disappointing person, but sad to say, I probably would have stayed if it was just me. The days before I left to go to Europe, there was a lot of love between us. It felt like we had gotten really close because we were together for a whole week uninterrupted.
But did it though? Because what you've just told me is that you, during that week of renovating his bathroom and spending that time, he was deep in the abusive cycle and he wasn't being present and he was prioritizing people who weren't you. And he was winding everything up to a point where you grabbed your bag and he told you to leave.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to reflect on because he had the lever in his hand. Yes, there were moments where he was pulling it and making me feel so destabilized, but all he had to do was stop and the love was back. And so the cycle was almost daily at this point. We could start the day in a complete place of collapse, and we would always end the night hand in hand in love. And so the day that I left him to go overseas, we ended on the love. We didn't end in a place of collapse. And that felt really great. I felt really secure leaving the country at that point.
So, knowing where you were mentally and emotionally at this point in time, how did it feel to be so physically separated from him? I mean, from a time zone perspective, you couldn't just drive an hour and be together. How did that feel for you and how did it seem to feel for him?
It felt really precarious, but at the same time, I had a lot of emotions. I was really genuinely excited to be going on this trip. I was doing it with people who were very important to me, and I knew we were going to have a good time. I also relied on those very last moments that he'd given me, and they were beautiful and they were calm and they were loving. And so I felt like I couldn't really ruin anything if I wasn't in the country. And so we'd stayed at this place of love. By the time I left to go to Europe, I was physically exhausted because I'd been working all week trying to get this bathroom renovation done. I was panicking because I hadn't actually completely finished the job. And so I wanted him to be able to finish it so the bathroom was functional. That was the whole point of getting it done that week. I was feeling excited because we had been planning this trip forever and I was doing it with people who were very important in my life. And I knew that it was going to be a great trip. And so when I left, I don't think the fact that I was leaving the country had impacted me as much as you would think because we already had distance between us our entire relationship. We live so far apart. We spent a large portion of our time separate, and a lot of our communication was via the phone. And so I didn't feel like I had lost any of that contact with him. I would still have it. We'd also spoken about keeping in touch, and if I needed him or I needed to talk to him, he was just a text message away. So we did make plans to keep in contact. And I think the biggest impact was time zones, time difference. When I arrived, we landed in Budapest in the first instance. And I was exhausted, but I was excited to be there. We had arranged to catch up one evening. We decided to call each other and have a chat before I went to sleep, but he didn't respond to me. And I got a little bit sick. I got a viral infection and I was feeling really down and depleted. I was just so disappointed and I was panicking a little bit because of all the things that had been going on. And I didn't hear from him. And then I eventually did hear from him, but he was very scatty in his contact. And then he eventually told me that he was sorry. He ended up supporting a friend who had ended up in hospital because of a gang rape that she'd experienced. She went on a date and he'd taken her back to somewhere and she'd found herself in this horrible position and ended up in hospital. And so it was yet another one of these instances where I could no longer be upset because the thing that had happened that had kept him from talking to me was so huge. How do I have personal feelings in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. When he's showing up to support someone who's going through one of the worst things that you could imagine going through, it's hard to say, "But I wanted to talk to my boyfriend," it's incredibly complicated.
It is. And I think it's more than I just wanted to talk to my boyfriend. I wanted to check in on my boyfriend because my boyfriend wasn't well himself.
And that's the other layer, right? It's easy to sort of see this as being, "Oh, I just wanted to have a normal conversation," but you had a lot of motivation behind making sure he was okay, and like we've said a few times, you were his emotional life raft at this point. So, how was he standing up if you weren't there?
And I think he was standing up just fine without me. And maybe that had a little bit of a jab in the ribs as well for me. But I do recall trying to temper myself and not to try and inflate a situation or create more conflict between us because he wasn't there to take a call. I don't think I did it very well though, because again, it ended up spiraling into another Danny Jesse conflict.
So, what was this particular conflict about? Was it about you not understanding him? Was it about you not being present with him? About big dicks? What was this particular conflict about?
This was a really interesting one. It began with me being the aggressor almost, me being upset or disappointed that he wasn't there for me. And he was trying to soothe me through that and talk through it. And then it very quickly flipped. I remember themes of me interrupting his time with his children. He was trying to spend the day with his children, and I was coming at him with this disappointment that I didn't trust him, that I would not let him have friends in his life that he could be around. It spiraled very quickly into a lot of things. I recall during this argument, he said to me on the phone, "You're going to regret having done what you've done. You're going to suffer now for the next 3 days." And that stuck with me because guaranteed for the next 3 days, I did suffer.
And you were there with family. Have you spoken with them about this period of time, about what they observed in you?
Yeah, I was there with Wayne and my auntie and her partner, and we have all spent a lot of time together and done a lot of things together. I thought during this time I was being really cool and calm. I didn't want to ruin the trip for anybody else, but inside I was falling apart. The things that he was quote unquote punishing me with were just next level. He had fallen into an alleged dissociative episode that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. He was sending me videos of really concerning behaviors, of self harm, of thinking he had trackers in his teeth, of going to the shop half dressed as I don't know what, but with a lot of eyeliner on and sending me pictures from outside the local shopping center. It was just a lot of things that I had zero control over. And all I could try and do is beg for him to be okay. How do you beg someone to come back to sanity? It's just an impossible situation. He had sent me very distressing videos, and I had considered contacting someone to go and help him. I thought I had thrown him into this place of just absolute horror.
I actually remember you showing me one of these videos and just, jump alert for listening. There's one video he sent you where he was literally picking at his teeth and making them bleed to try to remove the trackers.
It's a lot. It sounds like the stuff of movies, but it was very real life for me. And that video you talk about, he was picking at his teeth. There was blood in his mouth. It was completely and utterly mind boggling. I was sitting in my room in Budapest in this Airbnb, falling apart, trying to fix something that I didn't think was that bad in the first place. I was disappointed that my boyfriend hadn't spoken to me when he said he was going to speak to me, and then it ends up here. And then I'd walk outside my room and try and plant a smile on my face and try and not impact everybody else's time because of this situation I put myself in.
So, what happens after the 3 days end?
So I recall when it finally calmed down, I had video called him. We were leaving Budapest to go to Croatia. And it was a really nice phone call. And I was just so happy to have some kind of grasp on calm again. And I do recall having it on video and showing everybody at the station, at the train station, and everyone waving hello. And I was like, okay, everyone can see we're okay. I'm okay. It's fine. We board the train to head to Croatia and we settle in at Croatia. It is a stunning, beautiful place. It's so surreal being there. And I was just really happy to be there. And we had this really cute Airbnb, and I was sending him a video of our Airbnb because it used to be a bakery, and so it was really cozy and cute, and I'd sent him that video, and then I hadn't heard from him, and all of a sudden, much later in the day, I get a message from him saying, "Hi, babe." And I was like, "Why are you messaging me so late?" And he said, "I'm in hospital." And my stomach dropped. I immediately started getting panicky, wondering what had happened to him. And not in an obvious kind of panicky way. I wasn't outwardly showing everybody that I was in distress because my boyfriend was in hospital. I didn't tell anybody at this point. I eventually told Wayne about it, and Wayne is probably more measured than I am as well and didn't catastrophize it. So I sat and waited to hear his story about why he was in this hospital.
And what was the story?
Initially, he called me to talk to me, and he was talking to me, but he was very incoherent. I couldn't understand what he was saying. And I heard a nurse in the background, and I asked him to put the nurse on the phone so I could talk to her. And the nurse had told me that he was found in a hotel elevator unconscious, that he had been brought to their hospital, and then she immediately started questioning me about what kind of drugs he takes. And I had no idea what to respond with. I told her, "I'm not even in the country. I'm overseas at the moment. I don't know what he's been doing."
Well, and also, drugs hadn't really come up again since the Roxy and mushrooms incident, right? Because there's a big stretch of time there between the worry that you had had when he wanted to go and do mushrooms and dissociate while he had dissociative identity disorder, and a nurse asking you while you're overseas what kind of drugs your boyfriend's on.
Exactly. He wasn't taking drugs as far as I knew because he was focusing on bettering his mental health. So this was a complete shock to me. And she kind of implied that they need to know because it helps them treat whatever's happening. But I was drawing blanks. I had no idea what he'd done. And so I continued the conversation with the nurse and I said, "Well, what happens next? What are we going to do? Do I need to send someone to help him?" And she said that they would observe him until he was okay and that they wouldn't release him until they had someone to take him home. So I got that information out of the nurse, and then he had to go because they were doing some assessments on him. So some doctors were walking in, and I was just completely gobsmacked. I didn't know what to think. And then we finally got to talk more about what had happened. And the initial story that I got from him was that he went to go and buy some drugs because he was feeling very low. He was feeling like he just needed to focus and he needed to be a better man and get his life together. So he wanted to go and buy some methamphetamines so that he could bring that focus and just catch up.
So let's also preface this that he's feeling low, so he drives an hour and a half to a different city to buy methamphetamine, which to your knowledge he had not used before, to feel a bit better.
Yeah. It all stopped making sense very early on in the story to me.
And why was he found in an elevator? Had he OD'd? Was he unconscious? What caused the finding?
Well, my assumption was that he OD'd. He told me a different story about how he'd gotten to that point. So he said he went to do this drug deal because the person that he usually goes to get drugs wasn't available. And so they had referred him to someone else an hour and a half away from where he lives, which is odd for so many other reasons, which I won't get into. But he said he walked into this drug deal and they offered him a glass of wine.
It's very polite in a drug deal.
Yeah, it feels very civilized for a methamphetamine drug deal. So he said after he had the wine, he couldn't remember. The next thing he remembers was waking up in the hospital. And so then I immediately moved into my fixer role. I wanted to know who these people were. Did he remember what they looked like? Did he know their names? Did he have their phone numbers? Was he going to report it to police? During this conversation, he also disclosed to me that there was another layer, another problem. When he was found unconscious, the police arrived and they confiscated his bag, which contained an amount of drugs.
A classic Danny plot thickening moment.
Yeah, it got really complicated in my head. He goes to a drug deal, they drug him, and then he leaves the room with the drugs that he went to get. I kept asking him questions like, did they take your money? Why did they let you leave with the drugs? What was the intention of drugging you in the first place? There were lots of holes appearing very early on in this story.
This is feeling a little bit like the moment you tried to comfort him when he was hospitalized with cancer, and he claimed that because he didn't have antibodies, he was okay. But you, having antibodies, would not be okay if you caught his sickness. There's some strange logic happening here, isn't there?
It's Danny logic on the fly. It's when Danny hasn't thought through his lies properly, I think is what was happening. So I started getting really suspicious about what had actually gone on here. But at the same time, I couldn't question him too hard. The guy's in hospital because he'd just been drugged by a group of horrible people. I kept probing more. And the more I probed, the less sense it made to me. And the less sense it made to me, the angrier I got. And I started spiraling. I started piecing together pieces of information he'd given me months before and started building stories in my head about what actually had gone down.
When you say pieces of information, what do you mean?
For instance, Lani. He told me this dramatic story how he'd met her and had come to her rescue out of the blue. But then I recall very early on in our relationship when he wanted to get his makeup done, he'd referred to a friend of his called Lani who knew how to do makeup for darker skin. And it kind of just hit me in that moment. Oh, wait, you knew Alani a lot earlier in the year. And then I started thinking about what Lani did and who she was. And I'm like every other person, my curiosity leads me to look for things, look for answers. And so I had found some information about Lani on the internet. And she was an escort. And he'd also been talking about these fantasies about being an escort. And I started piecing it all together, going, well, if you're lying to me about Lani and none of this story makes sense, what were you actually doing at this hotel? Drug dealers drugging people that are buying drugs off them does not make sense in any way to me. And so I think you can see where I'm going with all of this information.
I can indeed see where you're going with all of this information. Did you try to raise this with him at all?
Against my better judgment, I did ask him. I wanted him to explain how he actually met Lani. I felt like if I focused on that lie, if I could demonstrate that he told me one lie, I would have evidence to back me in suggesting there were more lies where that came from. And so I started saying, how did you meet Lani? And I kept pushing and asking him. And I'm doing this all via text because I'm in this Airbnb in the middle of the night in Croatia, sharing a room with Wayne. So Wayne is lying next to me. And he wanted to talk on the phone, and I couldn't talk on the phone to him because I couldn't wake Wayne up. And so it became this very long text exchange of me trying to pull information out of him. And so it eventually came out that he actually had met Lani a lot earlier than he'd said. And he explained that they'd met on an app, surprise, surprise, and that they'd never actually met each other in real life. They'd only just talked and they were just friendly. But then all of a sudden she appeared in his life.
So, what was the whole big story about him being at a work conference, the presenter, I might add, and her walking in and him needing to ceremoniously leave this workshop he was being paid to deliver to drive her to the airport and be her knight in shining armor? Where did that come from?
Your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea, but I suspect that they were probably far more entwined than I had realized. And it probably wasn't such a shocking thing to him. And look, to be honest, I'm not even sure he was delivering a workshop. Who knows?
So, this is all happening in the middle of the night while you're in Europe. What happens after all of this comes out?
He had to be transferred to another hospital, and he was very vague about the details, but then he started alluding to something more devastating that had happened. So I had already known he was found unconscious, drug affected. The police had confiscated drugs from his bag, and now he was transferring hospitals because they had to do further tests on him. And it eventually came out. And I want to be really sensitive about this topic because it's not something that you can say lightly. He came out and suggested that he had been drugged and sexually assaulted by multiple men in this hotel room. And that's how he found himself unconscious.
So did he just text you this story, or was any of this delivered by phone?
It was a mix. So initially he had texted me and he didn't say it outright. He didn't say, "This is what's happened." He said things like, "I didn't want to be in that room. I didn't ask for those men to have sex with me." And so it was kind of that presentation. And then I would hear doctors coming in and doing assessments and confirming what he'd said. They were performing a rape kit on him. And so I had just discovered this lie about Lani. I had fallen down this rabbit hole of thinking he was escorting. And then he kind of confirms that by telling me he'd been in a room and he was raped by multiple men. And so my mind was just on fire. I didn't know whether he was gang raped by a bad drug deal or he had actually gone escorting and had sex with multiple men and accidentally found himself in a hotel elevator because he took too many drugs.
Like you said, this is a really challenging thing to talk about, and neither of us were there. In fact, nobody was there except for Danny. So we'll never really know the truth of that situation. But there is something to be said for the fact that you have just had this realization that this quite large lie had been told to you, and quite an elaborate one, about how he had met Lani and the nature of their relationship. But it's not the first, quote unquote, gang rape that has been spoken about. While you were in Europe, was there a part of you that was feeling a bit shell shocked from the sheer tumultuousness of how much had happened since you left the country?
Absolutely. This was coming off the back of 3 days of absolute torture from him, as promised, when I was in Budapest. And now I arrive in another beautiful, surreal location, and now I'm dealing with my boyfriend being gang raped and or being an escort. It was just a lot, and I was trying to contain it so much. And I eventually shared with Wayne what had happened, and so I feel like I started to spill over at this point. I started to talk to you, I think, and I started to talk to my mum about what had happened. And then I sort of flipped into this role of, okay, I need to fix this now. And I immediately wanted to wrap him up again, put him in bubble wrap, make sure he was safe. Despite what had happened, despite why he was there, he wasn't in good shape, and I didn't want my boyfriend to be in that position. And despite what he thinks about me, I do feel deeply for his emotional state and for the way he feels.
So, what did wrapping him up in bubble wrap look like when you were on the other side of the world? How could you do that when you were so far away?
That involved recruitment. I had to find someone to step in and take care of him. And what better person to do that than the person that solely and wholly takes care of me? And so I called my mum and I was really honest with her. I said, "This is what's happened. This is what I think's happened." And I told her, "I think he might have been escorting mum." And that wasn't an easy thing to share with my mum, but I think it was important for her to understand where he was at. And so she very graciously agreed to go in and pick him up and bring him back to our house and make sure he was safe.
That's a very amazing and generous thing of your mother to have done, particularly considering all of the context. Did she share with you anything about how he was presenting? What was his behavior like? Was he okay? Did she give you any insight into that?
Yeah, I'm really grateful that I have her in my life and someone that I can trust in that way. And my mum is a very measured person and a very understanding person. And she also absorbs the impact of other people's emotions rather than wanting them to feel any certain way. And so I trusted her to do that. Also knowing that, she's worked in corrections and she's been around some really vulnerable human beings. And I knew she could handle it with dignity. She went to pick him up from the hospital. And I might add that he protested this a little bit. He didn't really want her to come and do that, but I insisted because the alternative was that he was released and he would be on his own in a hotel room, and I just didn't want any more chaos to come out of that. And so Mum went to get him, and he was very quiet. It was like he was avoiding facing her. I think she ended up sitting by his bed for an hour or so while he was still asleep, and she was waiting for him to wake. He eventually had to leave the hospital. They needed the bed, and so they shook him awake. And Mum had commented on the fact that he actually had quite a few bags with him. And she'd gone to pick one up for him and ask him if they were his because it was very confusing. He was found unconscious after a drug deal, taken immediately to hospital. So why did he have all these bags? But when she went to reach for it, he sort of quickly jumped up and went, "Oh, yeah, that's mine," and didn't want her to look in there. And so she just brushed it off and just asked him how he was and told him she would go and get the car to pick him up. But he was like, "No, I'm fine. I can walk with you to get the car." And she said he was really quiet, but he tried to joke a little bit with her, and she didn't want to talk about it with him because she didn't want to make him uncomfortable. So she kind of just let him lead the conversation. She brought him back to our house and he slept in my room and he slept with my dog who loved him. And he started talking to me when he was at my house, and he was sort of very somber, very quiet, but it was okay. He was safe. He seemed okay. Mum said he seemed okay. And so I was just relieved to know he was in that safe space.
I can imagine that you were. And there would have been some comfort in your mum saying that he was okay, because there was one thing for Danny to say, "No, no, I'm fine." But you've just heard this intense story about what actually happened to him. And maybe he's not the best judge of whether or not he is actually fine. But to have your mum reaffirming that he was okay and that he was in a safe and neutral place would have set your mind at ease, I can imagine. How did it feel once the intensity of what had just happened subsided and you could actually reflect on the last couple of days of actual torture?
Yeah, it was very comforting knowing that my mum had observed him. She had confirmed that he was okay physically, that he was safe in my bed, and I just felt massive relief at that moment. But it was still really overwhelming. I had all these doubts in my head about what the truth was. I had flashbacks of, when I think back now of these crazy videos he was sending me and the moments when he escalated and just the absolute disaster that had happened all while I was overseas for a week. And so the relief didn't last very long. As soon as he'd left my house, the attacks started coming towards me. I was a victim blamer. I was shaming him for being raped. I didn't believe him. I was unsupportive. There was just a whole raft of accusations thrown my way as soon as he walked out my front door. And so again started this spiral of punishment towards me. I recall getting videos of him screaming naked on his floor, begging me to talk to him on the phone. But I wasn't in a position to. I was sharing a room with Wayne, and I was trying to explain to him that I didn't want to have these conversations while someone else was sitting there listening. But he couldn't understand, and he was insanely emotional, and it just kept spiraling from there. We were moving around Europe, and so after Croatia, we traveled to Greece, and we were going to Crete to a small town called Palihora, which meant we had to drive from Crete airport in the middle of the night to get to this small town. And I recall I was shoved into the back of this convertible Mini, and we had all of our luggage, and so it's Wayne and I, and my legs were kind of crushed and sticking up, and my auntie's partner was driving, and my auntie was trying to navigate, and it was just a hilarious scene. And it was really fun, but at the same time, I had this little box in my pocket, which was Danny, and it was constant. And we're driving through, and I remember we hit this small town, and there must have been some kind of religious festival going on because all the streets were covered in people. And we sort of got lost, and we're driving along, and I was trying to help navigate. And then I get a text message from Danny, and it says, "I don't know if this is any of your business, But I thought you should know, on Sunday, I'm going to become a woman. So something in me immediately switched off. I had just had enough. I was exhausted, and I knew how important acceptance was for him. So I wanted to understand and accept, and that's exactly what I did. I told him, Danny, I am a heterosexual woman. I don't want to be in a relationship with a woman, but I can support you with this from a distance as your friend. And he immediately lost it at me.
Next time on Beyond Curious, we explore what happens when emotional fault lines finally give way, not into cracks, but into full continental drift. Because some people don't just shake your world, they split it open, redraw the map, and somehow convince you the new landscape is exactly where you're meant to be. And for Jess, the real question wasn't what would shift next, but whether she'd survive the next break.